Viewers and listeners to part 5 of our childcare market series. This is the final installment of the series, and we're fortunate enough today to be joined by Sheila Edwards, the founder and CEO of Aurora Early Education. They're one of Victoria's highest quality childcare providers. Sheila, thank you very much for making the time this afternoon.
Thank you, Marcello. It's my pleasure to be here.
Now, we're going to run through 4 or 5 quick questions, as is often the case for those viewers that have watched a number of these videos in the past, and we'll probably go for somewhere from 5 to 10 minutes. So to start us off, Sheila, obviously a bit of an interesting year, but how has Aurora been travelling year to date, and what kind of differentiates your group from a lot of the other operators in the childcare market at the moment?
Sure. Thanks, Marcello. I think it's a good one to start, with the discussions. As you know, 2020 has been quite an eventful year for the whole globe, including, the tiniest town in the tiniest, remotest part of the world. So, as you'd know, we were not spared here in Victoria.
Yep.
So I think for us, as we are a community-based service, childcare is very much the hub of any community. Parents and community rely on the operators to provide a good service, and COVID has been very much at top of mind. The last 9 months or so, we've been all dealing with, various aspects of COVID. So when you ask me that question, obviously COVID's an important part of that answer. And as you know, for the viewers who might not recollect, or just as a summary recap, back in March, the government of Victoria and the rest of Australia, actually, we all went under lockdown. That put quite a panic into the parents' minds, into the community minds. What are they going to do with their children? Who's going to look after them, etc., etc. And all of that resulted, obviously, in numbers started to drop very quickly. Parents were very much afraid of transmission, and at that point in time, very little information was known about the virus. So there was a natural, selection where parents decided they're going to keep children home. So that put operators in the space at risk. All of a sudden, a center that is 100% full has got 40% or 50% occupancy. That's going to really panic the whole sector. So we went through that phase, and of course we might be talking about this later in terms of, what assistance we had through both central, the federal government and even at the local levels. But essentially we were all very much in the space where we had to respond, effectively to our parents. So no doubt that, revenue was hit. Definitely we had, impact to occupancy. We had to, wonder about what we do with our staff, etc. and etc. So, yeah, so we were definitely, very much in the midst of all of that. And we seem to be sitting here, this side of that space, and that time where we seem to have coped, with all of the built-up resilience that we've had.
Perfect, and I think it was definitely a period where that government support for the sector was shown pretty clearly as well. I think you'd probably agree there, Sheila. We've kind of been preaching that for quite a number of years now, but it seems to keep increasing, and it was good. The support that was shown really shows how important that sector is to our economy, and that's been proven, I think, pretty clearly over the last 6 to 8 months. Now, moving forward as a result maybe of this year, but you may have had a view previously anyway, what do you think the future of childcare is going to look like from an operational standpoint?
It's an interesting question, and for me, the way I look at the sector is, let's understand, obviously, demand and supply. It all comes to what is there as a supply and what demand are we going to be getting in the future. And when we've done our projections, from an Aurora standpoint, we're a little bit of a interesting mix in the sense that my background is finance and corporate finance, and I come from that world. So when I look at any business opportunity, I look at its viability, both short-term and long-term, and we look at the quality of the product, the quality of the asset. And I think as much, probably even more than I do, that the last, say, 7 years, there's been a big focus on improving the assets, improving the services, and improving the facilities that we operators are using. And that has obviously created, a huge influx of, I guess, interest in the sector. And that's created lots of opportunities for new providers to come into the space, and also not just new providers, but the existing providers to review what sort of buildings they're operating from. And as part of this exercise that, there are, the sectors divided into, council run operations, you've got the private sector, you've got the not-for-profits, and so on. And you've also got community-based services. And all of them have traditionally been running from, different types of buildings, whether it's co-located, whether it's part of an independent service, etc. I think the whole market has been undergoing quite a big focus and a review. And as part of that, we have had to review where we want to go as a business, as a brand, as a service provider. So we have got a very clear vision of where we want to be. We want to operate from a very high quality center. That means that we will be engaged very early on in the piece, whether if we have a leasing opportunity, we would be talking very early with our prospective landlords or prospective developers with an idea of what Aurora service might look like, because we feel we have a specific a number of specifications we'd like to see in the building, and that would match our philosophy and our pedagogy. So part of that progress in terms of the focus of the industry has obviously led in some areas to lots and lots of services being opened up, lots of DAs still sitting waiting to be delivered. So in some areas that could have been caused a mismatch between demand and supply. And in other areas, there's still very much an opportunity. COVID, in what has happened, is obviously the children have not gone anywhere. Clearly, they're still the children. Children are still waiting to come back to the services, as we have seen. As soon as the restrictions were lifted, families were very willing to jump in and start, utilizing the services. But what has happened is there's a key part of the economy which is driven by migration. And we know that that is going to become an impact. So I think that's where the balance sits, looking at what the prospects, what are the numbers going to show you, what are the economics going to show you, and obviously there will be impact to jobs, impact to, the job markets as we progress through COVID, as we recover through COVID. We've got to look at all of those impacts.
That makes perfect sense. And touching on a bit of the economic impact that you mentioned and those government subsidies touched on before, obviously they've been increasing year on year for childcare, and the arguments continue to go on as to why they should increase even more every year for that economy in Victoria and across Australia. But what is your current view, Sheila, on government subsidies for the childcare space, and how could those change moving forward as well?
Yeah, I think in my mind, Marcello, I look at early years as an essential part of brain development. So I think when you talk about the word subsidy, what happens in your mind is that it's a service that should occur, and the governments are helping, to cover the service, the fee. Whereas if you look at how schools are structured, and if you look at essential services like your healthcare and all of that, I think the attitude of governments is a little bit different. So whilst I agree that there's been some standardizations and some awareness that the subsidies have to be matched with inflationary and other indexes, I think the shift has got to occur where we believe that every child needs to be having an exposure to an early childhood education. And that is a fundamental difference if you look at Scandinavian countries, if you look at some of the other European countries, to where Australia sits. I think we always look at these two components and say, well, where do we want to drive this sector? And we know from a lot of economic studies and plenty of data and research that shows that for every dollar that is invested in early education and childcare, we get a $3 output back for that $1 that we invest. So it makes perfect sense for governments to look at early childhood as a pathway to increase participation, workforce participation, but more importantly, to ensure that the future generations have received a sound and solid education right from birth.
That's great, and that's really interesting. That's probably one of the first providers we've heard focus on that aspect. Obviously, the economic, but the evolution of those children attending childcare. That's really, really interesting to hear, Sheila. And to finish off, in terms of Aurora's view on childcare market rents, there's obviously been a bit of a big topic over the past couple of years as more and more centres are built. What's the group's view on these rents, past, present, future? Is there a benchmark? You can't really put it to a benchmark. What's your view on those figures?
I think everybody wants to have a piece of the pie, right? And when a market is growing, there's new people jumping in and going, look, this is a fantastic market. We want to be part of it. And that's fantastic. And I would say to that effect, the private sector has really taken a lead in Australia's early childhood paradigm shifting,
Yep.
So I think there should be recognition of that, because I think sometimes we get bad press in being part of the private sector. There are plenty of amazing private sector operators who are very focused on delivering high quality childcare and early education. And I would say, and I'd like to think that Aurora is one of them. So when it comes to rent, then you look at risk reward. What is the risk that landlords are taking, and what is the reward they are reaping? What is the risk that a service provider takes? What is the reward they're reaping? I think what has happened from a past, present, future perspective, if I look through the prism, there's been a gradual creeping of the margins and the benchmarks in terms of when I first went into the industry. And I remember talking to my banker at that stage, back in 2012, they would tell you that the rents should be between 8 and 10%, definitely no more than 10% of your, gross turnover. So when you look at where rents are sitting now and where they might be in the future, and I don't know whether there's going to be some correction in the future, but I do think that there has been a creeping up of that benchmark. I think some landlords and developers are very reasonable, others are not, and I can see that there are some disparities. There is a direction with some developers that might want to sort of claw out future profits, future earnings, in their pricing model. And I think we have to be very careful about that, because ultimately what happens is it sits with the consumer, and the consumer being our parents, and I think there has to be a conscious effort to make sure that we are balanced in that approach. So for Aurora, when we look at a deal, we want to ensure that we're not putting ourselves into a situation where we are going to be worried about, ensuring that we deliver to our landlord as much as we want to deliver to our parents. We don't want to cut corners with quality, So when we have a limited, and because the service, as you have a capped top line. You have a certain number of licenses, that's the maximum income you're going to get. Give or take a percentage or two here or there. We're not going to be selling or flipping more burgers. This is not about that. So we really have to work closely with our landlords And I think, to be fair, people like yourselves, CBRE and others, have a big role, an important education role to play, and to ensure that we're sitting at a very balanced level. So I think for me, I look at those components. I look at the component of what is going to take for us to continue to deliver a high quality service, and how much should I be then looking at what my rent should sit at, against the rewards and against the risks that each individual party takes.
Perfect. Well, Sheila, that's the basis of the question. So that's been very insightful. I'm sure all the viewers are going to have taken a fair bit from this, and I'm sure a fair few will probably want to reach out to us to connect with you as well, which we're happy to do. But again, we'll wrap it up there. Sheila, thank you very much for taking the time, and I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot more of you moving forward, and plenty more Aurora Childcare Centres popping up in the next couple of years as well.
Thank you. I hope so too, Marcello. Thank you very much
Thanks
for
so
having
much.
me.